Tonight, we look at the story that has been told about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey and why so many think her parents guilty, and what this tells us about the America she so briefly lived in.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 30 in the ongoing series. In the Bardach Report, we get an excellent appraisal. It's a very long article. It's a long-form article, 12,523 words, where crime writer Anne Bardach writes for Vanity Fair, talking about the circumstances around the Ramsey case at the time. Crazy as it may seem, by the time that this article came out, I think it was around about two-thirds of the way through 1997, the Ransom Note in full was finally released, and was basically released through this article, Missing Innocence. What do you think Bardach was sort of angling at by using that title, Missing Innocence? So in this episode, I will be dealing with less than 3,000 words of the 12,500 word long-form article. I'll just be sort of quoting here and there. I also want to deal with the response to her article, which was a film by Michael Tracy, a 2-hour film that Anne-Louise Bardach then wrote about, a response to her article in the Los Angeles Times, in an article called JonBenet is Advocacy, Not Documentary. It's also a very interesting article. You can go to my Twitter handle, which is @CrimeRocket, to get a link to that article by Anne Bardach. Before we get started with today's episode, if you haven't subscribed, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Also a big thank you to the 200 or so people who have subscribed since the last video. And let's get started. So it's an extraordinary article, Missing Innocence. I'll talk a little bit more about why I think as a writer she chose the title that she chose. I think it's, on the face of it, it's quite a weak title, but if you think about it in a lot more detail and in a broader way, it is symbolic and it's suggesting a lot of other things, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Let's first go into Bardach herself. You know, the reason why this is such a well-written, well-researched article, you know, it really sticks out head and shoulders among, you know, hundreds and hundreds, and, you know, just the incredible volume of, you know, forests have been cut down, writing about or publishing stories about the Ramsey case. And this particular article really stands up head and shoulders above all of that. Most of the rest is sort of tabloid trash and just neither here nor there. And so why is that? Why does Bardach's analysis mean so much? Why is it so useful? Well, I'll tell you why. Because she has experience as a crime reporter. She's not just some reporter reporting on the next story. She has experience. She knows what is important to highlight. She was a crime reporter in New York City, not some sort of backwoods place. And she began with the coverage of the murder of Sid Vicious's girlfriend, Nancy Spungen. And she'd also covered Charles Manson, Vicky Morgan, Ronnie Chasen, and it goes on and on and on. But, you know, she's not only a good crime reporter, she's also written books and is someone who's been, you know, she's been published in the New York Times, Politico, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, The Daily Beast, The Financial Times. So just a very credible, intelligent, analytical writer. What I'm going to do now is introduce you to her through her own voice, and that is courtesy of the Charlie Rose show. And so she did an interview on the 11th of September 1997, and that was shortly after, or sort of simultaneously to the article that came out, her article that came out in Vanity Fair in the October 1997 issue. So it would have come out on October 1st. Now, as a lot of magazine journalists know, the article is written sometimes months in advance. This one was probably written in around about July, and then it was probably edited and sort of lying on the editor's desk throughout August/September, and then it would have appeared around about October, perhaps slightly before October. Some magazines do, even though they have a certain date, the magazines appear sometimes a week or so earlier. And so this interview that she gave coincided with this article. Let's listen in.
Well, it was kind of an unusual turn of events for me, but basically after months and months went by and this case just stalemated and stalemated, and we learned no information, or very, very little bits of information parceled out, and as it stayed in the headlines, it became unavoidable. It became like, I started thinking about it, it's like Lindbergh.
Yeah.
I mean, how does this one child magnetize the entire country? And my roots I had come out of crime reporting, even though I haven't done it in a while, you know, myself and Graydon Carter were just saying, you know, is there ever going to be a solution to this case? And it was really the lack of information, and basically what has been going on for most of these months is what we call, you know, press release journalism, and just a dearth of information.
I got thousands of questions.
Okay.
Let me start with the notion of what's gotten a lot of publicity, a lot of attention, the ransom note.
Yes.
How did that come to public attention, A, and what did it say, B, and C, what's new about what we know?
Well, what's new in this issue of Vanity Fair was the very first time that the ransom note is published in full.
So looking back in hindsight, 24 years later, it's almost incomprehensible for us to imagine, wow, it took until sort of September, October, 9-10 months for the ransom note to actually be published in full. Now, why wouldn't you do that if you're trying to catch the killer, trying to catch the kidnapper, whatever it is? And, you know, bear in mind the Ramseys were purporting this theory. Why wouldn't you publish this excellent piece of evidence that is showing the writer of the ransom note? Why wouldn't you do that? Now, one possibility is, on the one hand, you're going to get lots of tips from the public who might say, well, it could be this person or that person. On the other hand, if you had published the ransom note immediately, and I'm talking about a facsimile of it, in other words, not a typed transcript, but actually where you can see the handwriting, you could also have a situation where people could come forward and say, wow, I actually recognize that handwriting. You see what I'm saying? Whereas by having this sort of gap, people wouldn't really know what was going on, and amnesia would set in, and they wouldn't necessarily link things, which I think is quite interesting and important. Now, we are going to deal with the ransom note separately in its own separate episode, and we're going to come back to Anne Bardach. I mean, no one speaks better about this story than she herself, but let's go into the article now. And as I say, it's a long-form article. I've also written a long-form article of that length, which it was intended as a magazine article. The magazine accepted it and later strung me along, and I eventually published that as my very first ebook called Reva in Her Own Words. It was the victim of the Oscar Pistorius thing, but that was a 12,000 word article which I ended up publishing as my first book on Amazon. And so anyway, we're gonna just deal with about a quarter or less of that article, just snippets, not necessarily in order, but just sort of highlighting some of the important parts. I do highly recommend that you read Missing Innocence yourself, the whole thing if you can. It is quite long. It might take you a while. It might take you half a day to read, but it certainly got a lot packed into it. So something I want to highlight is Anne Bardach referring to Peter Boyle. So she's referring to this other radio host who was doing sort of day by day, blow by blow coverage of the Ramsey case, and there's no one that is going to have better insight than somebody who does that. I did that on crimerocket.com, blogging about the Chris Watts case, when you're on that case every single day, just sort of, sticking to it and not going to anything else. Nobody has that kind of expert knowledge that you do. Every single day you're looking for some new information. Every day you find new information. And so that is what Peter Boyle's role. And it is through Peter Boyle's that we have got some fascinating investigations and interviews with, for example, some of the former Ramsey housekeepers, including Suzanne Savage. We're also going to come back to that. So in the article, it refers to Peter Boyle's accusing the Ramseys, and it's just worded so well. Peter Boyle's accusing the Ramseys of taking Colorado and the nation, taking America, on a 7-month low-speed white Bronco chase. And that's obviously a reference to the O.J. Simpson case, that sort of absurd scenario where you had this guy suspected of double homicide, and you sort of had the police slowly, agonizingly pursuing him, like from a safe distance. And I'm sure everyone in America remembers that very well. It's really famous. And of course, what happened ultimately at the end of that, when I say slow Bronco chase, I mean after that there was a trial, and what was the result ultimately. And so what you saw to some extent in the O.J. Simpson case was a lack of urgency, a lack of conviction from law enforcement, which is understandable in a way, because it didn't seem likely or even possible that this celebrity, this beloved star, would or could commit such a heinous crime, right? And so you had the same with the Ramseys in the same sort of situation. A beloved family in the community. This John Ramsey was a businessman, and he was employing a lot of people in Boulder. But besides that, he had just appeared in the newspaper for his success as a local entrepreneur. His wife was very involved in the local school and other things and so on. And so it just was a lot like this 7-month low-speed white Bronco chase up until that point. And I think you could argue that it's become a 24-year low-speed white Bronco chase. I mean, at least the O.J. Simpson case went to trial. The article goes on to refer to, this is by Peter Boyle, just referring to again to the O.J. Simpson case, saying real grieving parents, Boyle said, behave like Fred Goldman, not like the Ramseys. And so that was one of the criticisms at this point in the game, at around about 9-10 months, that the media, people who were observing the events on a day-to-day basis, were kind of saying, these people aren't acting right, these people aren't grieving properly. What these people are doing, how everything is playing out, doesn't look right. I'm just saying that is how they saw it, people like Peter Boyles. And Anne Bardach was repeating that. And then she also spoke about him repeating all the reasons why Americans found the Ramseys' behavior suspicious. Now bear in mind, this is several months after the crime, and nothing is really happening. And suspicion is growing against the Ramseys. This is the position as it was in 1997. So obviously there's been a change in sentiment. It's fluctuated this way and that way. But what is quite clear not only in the article but also in the interview about the article, Anne Bardach and the person interviewing her and Greg McCreary, there seems kind of a consensus that the parents had to have been involved. And if you think about how the mainstream narrative has evolved since then, and what is in the mainstream media since then, it certainly changed. It's now all about intruders, and could it be this pedophile or that pedophile. So it is interesting to go back to the source material closer to the case and get the sentiment and the vibe and observe how it has changed. And we get a strong sense from that, or of that, from Missing Innocence in Vanity Fair. Going back to Peter Boyles and what Anne Bardach says about Peter Boyles, she talks about him listing all the reasons why they found the Ramseys' behavior suspicious. He also mocked their profile as laughable, meaning the profile, I guess that's a reference to John Douglas, the profile of the quote-unquote intruder. And so he was saying that is just actually ridiculous, that whole thing. I agree with that. And then he also condemned them for not cooperating with the police. So you will hear in the subsequent narrative that the Ramseys always cooperated with the police. They did this and that and the next thing. But I'm just saying what these people were saying was that that was not the case. And also the police would tell you that. The police would say, you know, maybe they did cooperate with us, but it didn't feel like that to us, kind of thing. Another interesting reference in the article is to Judith Phillips, the family photographer and close friend of the Ramseys. Judith was friends with Patsy. Her husband was friends with John. And this refers to her seeing Patsy in March. Now, we've already referred to Judith seeing Patsy in February, where Patsy kind of broke down and so on. And anyway, she says that in March, Judith said that she was still a true blue supporter of Patsy Ramsey. She was still very much in her corner. And this is quoting from the article. According to Phillips, Patsy asked her to contact Leslie Durgan, Boulder's mayor and a pal of Phillips. Durgan, who describes Patsy as barely an acquaintance, was surprised at the message Phillips conveyed from her. "Why aren't you protecting me?" Durgan tersely replied via Phillips, "We are doing everything we can. I am supporting the police." And that's the end of the quote. So you get a sense through this how there was this sort of surreptitious networking going on, friends speaking to friends, friends pulling strings. And in this case, it was the family photographer who was a close friend of the mayor of Boulder. And it was, you know, can you protect us? Can you look after us? Can you shield us from kind of what is going on? And Durgan is kind of saying, no, I'm supporting the police. And so you would have these sort of lines drawn. And I think that is something that is often not recognized. One of the things that is so valuable in Bardach's article is how she sniffs out these underlying alliances, these underlying biases, these underlying relationships between rival factions, let's call it that. So this is again quoting from the article. She writes, 8 months after the murder, to the bafflement of the public, the FBI and the police, Haddon's team has been singularly successful in dissuading Boulder DA Alex Hunter from filing charges. The public perception, whether true or not, is that Hal Haddon can knock out Alex Hunter blindfolded with his hands tied behind his back, says columnist Chuck Green. So this is something else that I personally really appreciate with Anne Bardach. She writes her article by quoting and referring to lots of other sources, people that are much closer to the case than she was. Obviously, she traveled to Boulder. Obviously, she, investigated, but she's also analyzing and testing and sort of aggregating a lot of the statements made by a lot of other people. And so she's looking at what friends of the family are saying, what certain pundits and commentators are saying, and she's also, as we were about to see, she also interviews Alex Hunter for 3 hours and decides what she thinks about that. Something else that happens that is quite cloak and dagger and certainly quite exciting in this is that an anonymous source, we don't know who it is, approaches her, I think, in July and leaks information, which is sort of breakthrough information at this particular time. And again, now, 24 years later, it's no train smashers, not really a big deal. It's like, oh, the Ransom Note. I mean, most of us have read the Ransom Note. We've seen it over and over again. But by this time, October 1997, the Ransom Note was published for the first time in like national press. And so, America had been kind of banging down the door, just like, what is going on here? And it had taken months to actually simply publish the Ransom Note, and it was published through a leak. And it makes you wonder if that Ransom Note was never leaked. would people ever have sort of seen the ransom note? Would people have ever read it? And just think about that in a general sense. If the ransom note had never been leaked, you would kind of have a sense of, not through ignorance, not knowing who was likely behind the ransom note. And so who do you think that favored? In other words, withholding the ransom note, who do you think that favored? I think it's an interesting question. Again, it doesn't make any sense to withhold such a vital piece of evidence if there was a killer on the loose. If you were trying to find the person who wrote this ransom note, right? It doesn't make any sense to withhold it. So what is also very interesting in the Bardach Report is the explanation for the delay in the Ramsey police interviews. So bear in mind, the first interviews that ever happened took place in late April 1997, so after a 4-month delay, which is a really long time. Remember, the Ramseys were the people at the center of everything. They were the ones who knew what was going on in the house, what was going on with JonBenet. They were the people right at the center. So it just doesn't make sense to only interview them after 4 months. And so why did that happen? How did that happen? And so this source, this anonymous source that came to Anne Bardach, basically explained why to them. She said, this is a quote from the article, the Ramsey's lawyers had initially demanded that Patsy and John be interviewed at the same time, that the interview not exceed 90 minutes, that all previous police statements made by the Ramseys and others be provided to them, and that Pete Hofstrom be present throughout. Now, just think about that. If you have both John and Patsy present at the same time, they can't contradict one another, and they can sort of provide their statements off the others. Whereas if you interview them separately, you can get different versions of the same thing and all that kind of thing. The other thing that is interesting is that they don't want it to be very long. Think about it, an interview not exceeding 90 minutes, when, look how long the interview with Chris Watts took place. It was basically 4 hours on the Tuesday night, followed by, I think, around about 7 hours the next day, including the polygraph. I mean, he was there for longer than 7 hours, but the bulk of the next interview was 7 hours. And then there was another one in February for 4 hours. So if you add it all up, it's 8 plus 7 is 15 hours, and the Ramseys want 90 minutes. And in the end, that was rejected, and they ended up giving quite extensive interviews. I'm considering doing an analysis in 4 parts of those interviews, but let's first get through these 50 episodes. In any event, the FBI came in, according to the source, and looked at the demand list, the FBI, given to the DA from the Ramseys, and they said, no way, you are not doing this interview. In other words, law enforcement and the district attorney, we're not allowing this to happen. And so what's also interesting is early on the police, now bear in mind, the police are blamed by the Ramseys for botching their investigation, for whatever, for targeting the Ramseys in a rush to judgment. And this article also addresses that very eloquently. We'll get to that. So anyway, the police are being blamed for the problem here. And the problem, I guess, is that they think that the Ramseys were responsible. So that's why the police are kind of fingered in this sense. So, but the police invited the FBI to assist. So you'd think that if the police had some kind of agenda, that they would basically say, no, we don't want the FBI here. We want to conduct our witch hunt without interference. And according to a source, the DA's team, the district attorney's team, the prosecutors, disregarded everything the FBI expert suggested. So the problem here is really from the lawyers, from the district attorney's side. And you know, if you consider the fact that those indictments voted on by the grand jury just weren't approved, weren't signed, you can see that it does look like that is where the problem lay. So the anonymous source, and this is again quoting from Anne Bardach's report, says, quote, "The DA blew up with the police, but they cancelled and endured the wrath of the media." Not sure if that's the right word, but they cancelled. I think it's basically just they endured the wrath of the media, the Ramseys and the DA's office. This is the police. The police endured the wrath of the media, the Ramseys and the DA's office. So the police kind of became the whipping boy of the Ramsey case. Do you think that's fair? And do you think it makes sense that the FBI stand up for the police? Why would they? Are the FBI corrupt? I know a lot of people would say that they are. A lot of people would also agree that the police are corrupt. Why? Well, why would the police in 1997 want to accuse people that they hardly knew? And the Ramseys will say, well, it was a rush to judgment and they kind of had tunnel vision. But what we're going to see, and Anne Bardach is very sensitive to this, and it just makes complete sense, is that actually the police didn't have a rush to judgment. And there's a very obvious reason for that. We'll get to that. According to McCreary, this is another FBI agent, the rival agent, who was actually contacted on January 4th, I think around about the same day as FBI profiler John Douglas. And McCreary said, to his credit, I'm not getting involved in this, right? John Douglas said, I'll be there, and I think he arrived on the 8th. So according to McCreary, and this is again a quote from the article, if there's a tutorial on how not to conduct an interview, this would be it, end quote. What he's talking about here is a tutorial on how not to interrogate a potential suspect. It's this whole thing of interview people at the same time for not more than 90 minutes, so put a time limit on it. Now just bear in mind, if you put a time limit on an interview, and you the suspect, or you are the person being interviewed, and someone asks you a question, say the question is, what time did you go to bed that night? You can kind of go, well, let me think about that. So first I did that, and then that. It could have been 10 o'clock. Hold on a second. Actually, now that I think about it, maybe it was 9 o'clock. John, what do you think? I'm not sure. So in other words, you can really stretch out one question and waste a lot of time in a situation like that. The other thing that is interesting is that they demanded that all previous police statements by the Ramseys and others be provided to them, which in short means that the Ramseys demanded that the discovery be given to them. And what does that do? Is it basically, I won't say it puts the ball in their court, but it gives them this incredible advantage to know what the police know. So in other words, if you want to pretend something that's not the case, if you want to hide something, but you know the police know it, well then you know not to do that. So let me give an example. You might say, well, I just got up the next morning and I got dressed. But if you know that the police know that you didn't change your clothing, then you're going to be prepared how to respond to that. And there are a lot of things like that. And so that is giving them a huge advantage, is giving them the discovery. Now, I hope you'll indulge me just in an intertextual case that I sat in on. I was actually in court when this played out. I arrived for the first day of the defense case, and everyone was expecting the triple axe murderer Henry van Bardach to testify, because that is the protocol in a court scenario, is that the defendant, we call him the accused in South Africa, he testifies first, and then all the supporting evidence follows from the experts. And in the Henry van Bardach trial, the defense asked the court to allow him to testify later, and the court didn't really like that, but they did accept that. And I also think that kind of impacted on his credibility. So although I think it was quite a clever tactic, it was also something that showed perhaps a lack of confidence from the defense, and ultimately he lost the case and he was convicted of triple murder. So I'm just saying, having access to the discovery is advantageous to suspects. You've got to ask, why would you want to know what the police think or say or whatever? So if we go on a little bit further, she talks about the police interview taking place on April 30th, 4 months after the murder. And obviously at that time in 1997, a lot of the journalists and the public are wondering, what the hell is going on? Why is this taking so long? And, you know, every day that was going by, every week going by, every month that was going by was basically a taste of what was to come in the Ramsey case, which was that actually, my friends, years are going to go by and nothing's going to happen. And, you know, you kind of get a sense that this may have been a ploy from the legal side, is just slow everything down, try and get people to forget about this case. And that is an incredible thing with the Ramsey case, is that people haven't forgotten about it. And I think it's important that people don't forget about it. So this is another quote from Anne Bardach. She says in her article, quote, "After being pounded for refusing to cooperate with the police, the Ramseys gave in to separate interviews, but they held fast to their demand for a copy of the entire police file and the presence of Hofstrom." So they had legal counsel present while they testified or while they gave their statements. This is continuing with the quote, "Patrick Burke and one of his private investigators sat next to Patsy." So Patsy's got two people next to her while she's actually being questioned. And so what is quite interesting is she answered questions for 6.5 hours. So what is quite interesting in a very basic way, it's really true crime rocket science 101, is that you look at the transcript, and we have it, of the entire interrogation of Patsy, and you look at just how many pages it is, how many words it is, how long it lasted, and then you look at the same thing in terms of John Ramsey, and what do you see? That the police were far more interested in Patsy. They were asking her a lot more. Now, there could be an innocent reason for that, and one of the innocent reasons could be that Patsy was home a lot more than John. John was often not at home. Patsy was far more involved with the children than John was, just because she was also home more than what they were. But I mean, the other reason is that in Patsy's own version of events, she was the one who woke up, found the ransom note, and sort of ran through the house. She was also the one who called 911. Whereas John's story was that he took melatonin, an Ambien. I don't know where I came up with that. He took a sleeping pill. That apparently is quite normal. I think the housekeeper said that he often did that. And so John sort of takes himself out of the game, right? Then there's also the ransom note, which the officers wanted to know about, and the fact that Patsy had writing pads and all sorts of other things. So anyway, in any event, Patsy comes up. Patsy is more the focus of the attention in the police questioning than John is. Why is that? When John was interviewed, according to Anne Bardach, he was accompanied by Brian Morgan and also a private investigator, and he was interviewed for 90 minutes. So just compare those two. 6.5 hours for Patsy, 90 minutes for John. And that was just the first round. There was a questioning later, I think a year later, which was, I think, in a little bit more depth and definitely quite interesting. And in any event, the questioning in 1997 was by Detectives Tom Trujillo and Detective Steve Thomas.
We've been getting little morsels and bits of it. The district attorney has released this line or that line. And what we see for the first time in this issue is the extent of this note. And in fact, this is an extraordinary document. It's 3 pages long. It rambles on and on. It is clearly amateurish and adolescent. And if you look at the note, and I'm sure Greg McCrary can address this better than I, you can see that it starts off with one kind of penmanship, and it visibly changes as you get to the third page. But, you know, ransom notes are typically very brief. They're, you know, to the point. I have your child, give me the money.
Right.
They don't ramble on.
Right.
So clearly somebody spent a considerable amount of time hanging out in the kitchen, writing and composing a ransom note right after killing this child.
How did you get it?
Well, that's the $64,000 question.
It certainly is.
So we are at 35 minutes about in this episode. I normally cut you guys off at 25, so I hope you've enjoyed this episode. There's a lot more to dig into. So if you want to hear the remainder of this episode, head on to Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/TCRS, and it's on the $2 tier. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.
Me it, and I'm very distressed because there's an investigation going on in Colorado to try to find the source.